Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You'll permit me to stand on existing protocol. Let me start by also congratulating BusinessDay on your 24 years of existence. BusinessDay has indeed made an impact on the business environment in Nigeria. So congratulations. I would say that as KPMG, we're proud to be here this morning working with BusinessDay as technical partners for this event. For me, it's important that we contribute to the discourse on Nigeria's economic trajectory as we journey from economic restructuring to sustainable growth. This morning, I aim to do three things. One, assess the broad impacts of the ongoing reforms. Two, present a framework for translating reforms to sustainable growth and recovery. And thirdly, to distill recommendations for government and businesses. So let's get started. I always like to start with why. Why? Why do countries implement reforms? I see this from our research. We categorize it under 5 broad headings. The first is for stability. The second, for growth. The third, efficiency. The fourth, inclusion. And the fifth, access. When we speak of stability, so a country pursues reforms, usually to recover from or prevent impending macroeconomic crises. It's all about restoring confidence. When you talk about growth, it's about making economies more productive. Efficiency is about seeking to reduce waste and make public spending more effective. Inclusion is about reducing inequality and promoting a shared sense of prosperity to ensure that the economy benefits all rather than a few. And then access, you usually see countries implementing reforms because they want to access perhaps multilateral funding. So Nigeria is no exception. Nigeria has gone on a path of reforms for, I would dare say, all of the reasons I highlighted earlier. And there have been a whole plethora of reforms: fiscal reforms, sectoral reforms, monetary reforms, trade reforms. Almost everywhere you look, there have been reforms. This administration has been widely acclaimed for the boldness of its reforms. And, indeed, those reforms are all geared at strengthening diversification and improving domestic resource mobilization. If you followed the recent articles by IMF or Financial Times, they use terms such as the reforms have been encouraging and fundamental, or that the reforms have stabilized the economy and have clearly laid the groundwork for a broader recovery. So the reforms, lots of reforms, and the reforms have been great. But while those reforms have been great, there's also no doubt that they have been painful for the populace. And when I speak of the populace here, I'm speaking both individuals as well as for corporates. And we know where the pain points have been. It's in terms of inflation, in terms of currency rates, in terms of just what I will describe as, the general uncertainty that individuals and corporates have faced as they try to grapple with the reforms. So I thought that in framing our discussion this morning, we should seek to answer certain questions or just throw further light on them, which is to say, when we look at the whole plethora of reforms, are these the right reforms? The second question, are the reforms yielding the right results? And the third question, have we done enough to make the reforms sustainable? So let's examine each of these questions very quickly. In answering them, I like to look at them through three lenses. The first lens is looking at the comprehensiveness of the reforms. The second is looking at the responsiveness of the reforms. And then the third lens is to look at the sustainability of the reforms. So let's start by asking, are these the right reforms? And in answering that question, I would say, how comprehensive are the reforms that have been introduced? Now, at KPMG, from our extensive research and working with governments around the world, we've developed a framework. We call it the Growth Accelerator Framework. And it offers a lens to assess the comprehensiveness of Nigeria's economic reforms. In assessing the comprehensiveness, we look at it through 5 key lenses. The first is business enabling environment. The second has to do with entrepreneurship and the whole development of the ecosystem for the young population. The third is in terms of industrial development. The fourth, investment attraction. And the fifth, trade competitiveness. So we look at the reforms under each of these headings. And the conclusion we come to when we say, are these the right reforms? I think the answer to that has got to be yes, that we are pursuing the right reforms. I don't think Nigeria is short of ideas in terms of the things that need to be done. And indeed, when we look at the reforms Nigeria is implementing using our growth accelerator framework, I would say that everything here, there's been discussions around it. All the ideas here have been put on the table at various times to government, and there have been discussions around it. So what then is the issue? To my mind, I see 3 issues. Number 1 is an implementation issue, where I would say we've discussed a whole range of reforms, but there's clearly further work to be done in terms of implementation of certain reforms. You could almost go through this list and, draw circles and say, well, this one we need to do better, this one we need to do better, this one we need to get started, etc. I don't want to go through the detail of that in this presentation, but suffice to say, as a country, I think we are implementing comprehensive reforms. I think we have put all the ideas on the table in terms of what needs to be done. And I believe the challenge now is to just get it done and get it done in a structured manner. The other challenge when you think about the comprehensiveness is the issue of inclusiveness, which is where you then say, are the reforms driving inclusiveness in the economy? And I'll talk a bit about that later on. And some have said, there's also an issue of phasing of the reforms. That do we try and do everything at once? Do we attempt to boil the ocean? Or do we try and ease the reforms in? So I would just put these posers on the table, but I would say, in answering that first question, are these the right reforms? The answer would be yes, but we need to work on implementation, we need to work on inclusiveness, and we need to be very careful regarding the phasing. Let's go to the second question. Are the reforms yielding the right results? So the data is there on the table that from a responsiveness standpoint, the economy is showing early signs of recovery. So you could argue that the economy is certainly moving in the right direction. Economic growth is up, trade balances are up, foreign currency rates seem to have stabilized. There's availability of foreign currency for those who seek it. Investor confidence in the economy is improving, and we also see some improvement in the ratings, the sovereign ratings of the country. But then, if you were to ask this question, are the reforms yielding the right results? I think the answer would be yes and no. And it will kind of depend on the segment of the population you're speaking to. Maybe for the investment community and for the business community, the answer might be yes. But clearly, for the general population, the answer one invariably hears is no. And so we must ask the question, why do we still have yes and no? To my mind, when you ask the questions of the segment that will say, no, the reforms are not yielding the right results, it's simply because they're yet to feel the impact of those reforms. How do you address that? How do you address what some have started to refer to as reform fatigue, i.e., a feeling that there are lots of reforms going on, but we're not seeing the benefits or the outcome of it, 2 years into the process? I think that to prevent reform fatigue, we've got to do a couple of things. The first is to improve communication, because in this reform journey, it's important that we build public trust and patience. And you can only build public trust and patience by explaining and re-explaining and re-explaining in great detail the benefits that are expected to accrue. So for me is improving communication. The second way in which we're going to prevent reform fatigue is clearly leading by example. That's a known tenet of any leadership change. You lead by example in terms of the behaviors that you want to see. Words must match actions. And then the third area is that in implementing any reform program, you've got to have quick wins that can impact the generality of the population as quickly as possible. So to get away from this yes and no, to my mind, to address the no, it's those three things: communication, leading by example, and then looking at the question of quick wins to address the more vulnerable. As we talk about building patience, I would add that building patience is important in the journey we're on, because no reforms don't happen overnight. So building patience is key. The other point to realize here is that reform is not a one-time intervention. Reform is a continuous process of change. And no matter the economy you look at, there's still undergoing reforms. When President Trump speaks about his big, beautiful bill, it is a package of reforms that he's talking about of the Nigerian economy. When you listen to the news in the UK, it's about reforms. So there's a recognition that The reforms, going about reforms is a process. It's a cycle that starts with diagnosis, defining the problem, consultation and mobilization around the solutions, implementing solutions, monitoring them, obtaining feedback, tweaking the solutions, and the cycle starts all over again. So the populace needs to be patient, and it's important in our reform journey that we build that patience. Let me touch on the third question very quickly. Have we done enough to make the reforms sustainable? You know, in answering this question, I like to do peer comparisons. And I know some people will criticize peer comparisons and say, oh, but the context of those nations are different. I accept that because I also believe that reforms to work must reflect the realities of the country. But at the same time, I do think there are lessons to be learnt from other economies that have implemented reforms and where we are seeing more sustainable change. So in doing a quick peer comparison, I'll look at Indonesia and Vietnam. But you could add any other countries. You could add South Korea, you could add Chile, you could add Rwanda. When you look at the two countries I'm comparing Nigeria with, you'll see similarities in terms of population, in terms of the starting points of our GDP in 1985 and the current GDPs. And what you see here is a marked difference in terms of the trajectory each country has gone on over what is essentially like a 30 to 40-year period. What lessons do we learn from those reforms? What have those countries done? So let's talk about what are the cross-cutting insights. The first thing that comes out is that to make reforms sustainable, it's a combination of institutional, political, social, and economic strategies. I'll repeat that. To make reforms sustainable, it's a combination of institutional, political, social, and economic strategies. It's not just one thing. The other thing that comes out strongly from this is that for reforms to be sustainable, it must be institutions, not personalities, that drive reforms. And I say this with a sense of caution and responsibility, because we often hear of how this one individual is so reform-oriented, and therefore, we're grateful that we're on this path. It's not a sustainable path if all the reforms are dependent on one individual. Because when that individual goes, things may change. So it's institutions that must drive reforms. And that's one of the big lessons. We've got to build strong institutions and anchor our reforms on institutions. How do you do that? It's by codifying reforms into law. That's how you anchor the reforms, through institutions. The other lesson that we learn from countries that seem to be doing this well is that there's an agreement amongst the political elite as to the direction of the country, so that no matter which party comes into power, the direction of the country is clear. We've talked about this before in Nigeria. We refer to it as the elite consensus. It's very important because to prevent flip-flops, we've got to all agree on what the long-term vision for Nigeria is. That's what we've seen helps to drive sustainability. The third thing is about the planning framework. So we have master plans, we have development plans, we have budgets, etc., ensuring these things are all integrated. The other day I was looking at the sectoral plans that we've developed for different sectors over the years. They're great plans. They're comprehensive, but everything has got to link together. The plan, the budget, the 3-year development plan, it must all be coordinated. The fourth thing is around decentralization and a real focus on where is our comparative advantage as a nation. So subnational governments are empowered to manage their resources, and this is all in coordination with the direction at the federal level. The other thing we see in successful reform programs from a sustainability perspective is that strong investment in human capital and technology. But you don't get away from the fact that behind all of this is committed and accountable leadership. So in answering that question, have we done enough to make the reforms sustainable? My answer would be no. I think we need to do more. So that brings me to really, what are the recommendations around what we need to do in answering those questions? Are these the right reforms? Are they having the right impact? Have we done enough to make them sustainable? We have a number of recommendations here, and I won't go through all of them. But suffice to say that when it comes to the comprehensiveness, I've said it already, it's about really doubling down on implementation, getting that right. But beyond that, there's some other factors. There's security, which remains a concern. No matter what business or sector you speak to, there's still nagging questions around addressing the security challenge. So I think that's something that's critical as well as we pursue reforms of our security architecture. The other thing I'd emphasize under comprehensiveness is the role of technology as a means of reducing leakages and improving the quality and efficiency of public procurement. I know steps are underway to utilize technology, but when we look at countries that seem to be getting this right, there's an increased emphasis on technology. What do they call it? E-citizen. Every citizen, having a portal in which you go in and all your interactions with government are managed through that one secure portal. On the issue of responsiveness, it's about inclusiveness of reforms, making sure that there's benefit to all, not just to a segment. Because it's not just the investor community that needs to be happy with the reforms. It's the whole population. So there I'd spoken about communication. I'd spoken about, to communicate, you've got to have a means of measuring. And that speaks to the metrics that you use to measure. On sustainability, it's about strong institutions. It's about reforming the legal system to ensure we embed reforms into law and policy. And then also empowering and partnering with the private sector. As I said, I've put on this slide lots of recommendations, but I don't want to go, because of time, I won't go into them one by one, but I think you get the general direction in terms of recommendations. So as we sit back, what does this mean for businesses as you think about the environment we're in with all the reforms taking place and the challenges ahead for us? For businesses, I think it's so important that businesses step forward and take the front seat in terms of the discussions around national economic development. Businesses must participate actively in public-private dialogues to influence decisions in this constantly evolving regulatory landscape. Each time we speak with government officials, we sense this welcoming attitude of saying, come and talk to us. Tell us what you want and what you need. So businesses must step forward to do that. There are opportunities in this economy. Even in the environment we're in, there are opportunities opening up in various sectors. Businesses must align their interests with the nation's economic direction and, exploit the opportunities that exist. It requires agility. It requires proactive risk management in order to do so. And an investment in these areas is important. On the horizon, we have the artificial intelligence and technology disruption that's going to affect many industries. So for businesses, it's important as well within this evolving regulatory landscape to make sure that we're not caught with our pants down on the issue of technology and artificial intelligence. So investing there is critical as well. But we've got to balance those investments. There's a balance between technology and workforce upskilling. You've also got to invest in upskilling the existing workforce, because we also need to create and generate employment in Nigeria. The other thing I would talk about here for businesses is the whole issue of supply chains and the investments that must be done to secure supply chains. These are some of the messages and implications for businesses. There are a number of other implications, and these are well captured in our CEO Outlook report that was done for 2024, looking into 2025. I do commend participants to scan the QR code on the screen, and you'll access the report where you'll see lots more insights. So as I close, I just want to leave us with these closing thoughts. It's a quote by a gentleman, Peter Welsh, who emphasizes what we know, that for an economic recovery program to be effective, it must not only create a short-term economic boost, but it must also generate lasting value. And that value must be from the perspective of all participants, not some participants. It must generate lasting value. And then, of course, I leave you with my own quote, which is that reforms succeed not just because they are the right reforms, but because they are responsive to the objectives and they are also sustainable, because that is what long-term value is all about. I thank you for your attention.